everyone, and welcome back to another episode of CityCast, the podcast that works to inform McMaster students about local issues and politics in Hamilton and how they can get involved and advocate for change. Today we have an exciting episode for you. During our time at CityLAB, we interviewed two experts in the field of affordable housing and homelessness in Hamilton. Affordability and affordable housing are current buzzwords we often hear in the news and in our studies at university. But do we really know what the affordability crisis is? Do we know what affordable housing is? This episode will break all of that confusion down. We will be discussing affordability and the role of social services, what exactly affordable housing is and the different avenues to achieve this, and how you can get involved if you are passionate about these issues. During this COVID-19 pandemic, we are often reminded that vulnerable populations are affected disproportionately by this crisis. Someone experiencing poverty or homelessness does not have the same access to tools in order to socially isolate and distance themselves, making them extremely vulnerable to this virus. Many food banks, soup kitchens, shelters, community support groups, and safe injection sites have temporarily closed down due to this virus. It is important to note who will be affected by these closures. Keep that in mind as you're listening to this episode and maybe brainstorm some ways you can help. We really hope you enjoy this episode and it provides you with the knowledge and tools necessary to invoke change in your community. Let's get into the show. The first guest we have today is Greg Tedesco, a social policy analyst for the City of Hamilton. Here's a little bit more about Greg.
Hi everybody, I'm Greg Tedesco. I currently do social policy work with housing and homelessness in the city, for the city. My background is in social work, so I went to McMaster, and I've done a lot of various types of roles in the city. So I should say that my first degree was in poli-sci and history. So if you ever think that whatever you're doing right now is what you might be doing forever, you can always change it. Don't worry. You have some flexibility over time. So I started working with children and youth. I've been in Hamilton for more than 15 years now and went back to school to do social work and knew I wanted to do something very frontline. Didn't realize I would do something as frontline as direct street outreach, which I did for a number of years. So working with people experiencing homelessness out on the street. I mean, it's as simple as that in various settings. And that really gave me a really good foundation of learning that I did not anticipate to get, where I was going into basically every organization in the city, going out to every corner of the city, seeing how things operate, seeing how things work for people, seeing how things at times don't work for people, and just how, that system is there that we've kind of created as a safety net, either supports or doesn't at various times. So in between there, I did some work with some community development and social housing, and now, as I mentioned, doing policy stuff here, and yeah.
We also have Jeff Neven on the show today. Jeff is the executive director at Indwell. Here's a bit more about Jeff.
My name is Jeff Neven, and I'm the executive director at Indwell. We develop affordable housing with supports, primarily for people living in poverty due to a disability. So the majority of our folks have spent time in a psychiatric hospital. Most have been homeless at some point and are on pathways towards kind of life transformation. What we do is both affordable and has supports attached to it. So it's a relatively narrow niche of the overall affordable, or what we're using more lately is community housing spectrum. How I got into it, I actually started volunteering on the board. And so that's a little plug for you, is go find people that you want to be near, organizations that you want to be near, and start volunteering and think carefully about the spots. And so I started volunteering. The organization was very, very small at the time, and they had a promotions committee of the board. And so I volunteered on that. And a year later, they called me up and said, "Would you like to come on staff?" That was 2001. Through that experience, I got to go back to school and get a Master's of Social Work at Laurier, focusing on kind of the macro side of social work. So there they call it community planning, policy, and organizations, as opposed to more like the counseling or individual kind of side of social work. In this role, as executive director for about 7 years, and before that, another 12 as director of operations. And it's fantastic when every day you get to work with an inspired group of people who want to make social change, and they're all in to make that happen. And every day I'm just overwhelmed by the need and the challenges, and it's we can talk a bit more about that. I can give you my perspective, and Greg can probably give you his perspective on what that looks like in Hamilton.
One of the barriers to us understanding what affordable housing is that there is no universal definition of the concept. We asked our CityLAB class what they thought affordable housing was. Many of their answers were that it is an accessible type of housing, where the rent may be geared to a household's income. It may be housing that remains affordable no matter the shifts in the economy or the increase of market rent. It may involve a form of mixing of communities into a building or into a community. Although many of these answers are on the right track, it still does not give a definitive definition to the concept of affordable housing.
I think affordable housing is kind of confusing anyways, because it's just two words that are always thrown together. And, generally there's ideas of, who doesn't want affordable housing to begin with?
When the government puts out a policy and says, this is how we're going to, in this round of funding, or in this is how we will define affordability in this area. We're involved in a project, Jamesville, which is right by the new GO train station, West Harbor Station. There, I think in the official RFP, affordability was considered 125% of average market rent. You can Google it. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has an index of what rents are at, and they look at buildings that are more than 6 units, and they track the rents. Now, those rents are artificially held down because of rent control. So if you're living in a unit, your landlord can only increase it by the maximum allowable, which is usually between 1% and 2%. Each year, so that keeps it down. But if you go try to rent an apartment at that rent, it'll be incredibly difficult. So I think like the average market rent in Hamilton is probably around $850 or so for a one bedroom. Yeah. So then 125% of that would be approaching about $1,000. That is a stretch. Typically, all the funding requirements that identified affordable housing over the last, let's say, 2 decades, identified affordable housing as 80% of average market rent. The 30% of income is the most widely understood definition, but the most used definition is 80% of average market rent. And that is shifting, and we're now adopting the U.S. definition. And you see this creeping in the National Housing Strategy in their rental housing incentive. Started using a different number, and because they're trying to attract the private sector into building. And so they're using 30% of median household income in the CMA. So Hamilton's household income is actually quite a bit higher than Toronto, because our CMA includes Burlington, Ancaster, Grimsby, and its household income. So the household income in the Hamilton CMA is, I think it's about $89,000. So 30% of that, and then you divide that by 12, and you end up with about $2,100 per month in rent. By that definition, is considered affordable. So I'm glad you went, because this is one of the biggest challenges we have, is that we think we're all using the same word and the same definition.
Essentially, affordable housing has become a responsibility of municipalities to provide. Jeff Neven and Greg Tedesco discuss how there is an Americanization of social policy occurring in our cities. We are using a reactive approach to addressing homelessness and poverty. We are using affordable housing and mixed income housing to fix poverty, but we aren't actually addressing the structural and systemic causes of poverty. Why aren't we implementing something like a living wage or a universal basic income to address this poverty? This is a gap that exists within our urban governance. This is the basis of why affordable housing and other social assistance mechanisms are flawed today. They are not used proactively to help give more opportunity to those who are struggling. They are used reactively to catch people once they've already fallen.
Social assistance rates have basically been frozen for the last 30 years, actually worse than frozen, because they're decreasing compared to inflation, while housing prices are growing really rapidly. That's a policy shift that we as Canadians have decided we would like to go, again, more in the direction of the US, where rather than to help people with basic income or social assistance that's comparable to something that you can purchase in the market, we've chosen that we actually want to shift that. So rather than give people enough money so they can rent an apartment from the market, go to a grocery store to get their groceries, we've shifted that we want to underfund what people get, and therefore then they need affordable housing, food banks, soup kitchens, which is, I would say, a disastrous social policy direction. And if we're looking at where are we going in 20 years, I think this direction is probably going to be one of the most catastrophic. So if you're living with a disability, which, I'm thinking of people in my head right now. So let's just say you're visually impaired and you're not at the top of the resume pile for most jobs if you are visually impaired. So you get $498 a month to cover all your rent and utilities and housing costs. Some of you might be able to do that by putting 4 or 5 people in a 1-bedroom apartment and making a go of it. When I've said, I bet you none of you students, I've said that once at a university, and somebody's like, no, I pay $100 a month. There's 8 of us in a 1-bedroom. Oh, okay. Yeah, you all know that guy. The point is what can you buy for $498 in terms of rent and utilities long term? You can't. And so it's mounting. We're seeing, I'm sure you're seeing this, and it's not just Hamilton. Indwell's now in 6 municipalities. The rural ones, where they never saw homelessness, have homelessness problems like they've never seen before. And we're seeing more street homelessness, more people sleeping rough. The type and availability of opioids, as well as crystal meth and other things, mean that we're seeing more people with addictions issues, which I understand. When there is a hopelessness, you turn to escape. It's not looking bright. As an organization, the amount of applications that we get is just ramping up to the point that most people we're never going to be able to help. We get at least 5 applications a day. So we need to build 5 apartments a day. As our entire sector in Ontario, we're not anywhere close to that. And I'm just talking about just our organization needs to build 5 a day. Yeah.
A type of affordable housing that has gained popularity in many cities is mixed-income housing. Mixed-income housing involves the social mixing of groups belonging to a variety of incomes. This can be in the form of mixed-income communities or actual mixed-income apartment buildings. This type of housing looks great on paper and in theory, but in practice, it rarely works. Jeff and Greg give us some insight into the trouble that occurs for mixed-income housing, using examples from the city of Hamilton.
One of our staff just shared this with me as I was leaving the door to come here. And she said, I can't go to this particular coffee shop in Hamilton, in a gentrifying neighborhood, because of the way that they speak about our tenants. Now, tell me more about that. And she said, well, one of our tenants was getting coffee there. She was also getting coffee there. And as he left, the owner of the coffee shop, along with some other customers, started making fun of his coat. That doesn't happen where my office is at Main and Kenilworth, where we have Ward 4 coffee, and you have owners who live and work in amongst a lower socioeconomic group and have firsthand connection with people living in poverty. And I can say the contrast is stark. I'll give you another example. We have a gentleman, I'll call him Frank for fun. He's on our waiting list. And like I said, our waiting list is growing so rapidly that we're actually looking at redoing it entirely. He comes at least once a week to say, has he got any housing for me? And I say, Frank, I know where you live, and you're living in social housing already. And he's like, yeah, but it's one of those buildings where there's wealthy people, and every time there's a problem, and he's an Indigenous man with mental health and addictions, he says, every time there's a problem in the building, guess who they blame it on? And so he has affordability, but we have problems in Canada. We stratify ourselves socioeconomically in coffee shops. We do it in restaurants. We do it in public spaces where we go to the library, where we do our shopping. And I would say mixed housing is wonderful, as long as there's an intentionality of people with resources to extend those to people without. But if it just means that your neighbor is wealthy, it actually doesn't improve your life. They're more likely to call Children's Aid on you when you couldn't get back from your appointment across town on the bus and your kid stood outside of the door, rather than say, oh, I'll take your kid in. Life gets actually worse in many cases, not in all cases. So we have to figure out how to blend across socioeconomic boundaries rather than just coexist in the same proximity. And until that gets figured out, we can actually do some serious harm. You look at cost of things. I live in Ward 3. You can get really, really cheap pizza on every corner. And that's what a lot of people are living off of for their sustenance. All of a sudden, I used to live on Locke Street 20 years ago, where you also could get those kind of things. You can't anymore. So where do you get the things you need when your neighborhood changes? So I would just push back on that. I think, Greg, you said it's more complex, and I wanted to just add some. Yeah. It's definitely complex. I would say actually it comes down to this, is that from a policymaker perspective, and I'll add the word some people, see those who are living in poverty like pollution. And back when I was in high school, New York City used to take their garbage on barges and dump it in the Atlantic Ocean, and they had a phrase, the solution to pollution is dilution. And I think that's actually how we treat people living in poverty, people who are struggling with mental health and addictions. We treat them like pollution, and somehow we think that if we see less of them, then somehow our society is better off. So if we can disperse it, it's a fundamentally flawed philosophy because it's not person-centered in terms of, okay, how do you come alongside someone who has an addiction? How do you come alongside someone who needs connections in the community to figure out how to navigate getting an apartment for various barriers that exist? And so we would say the solution is actually engaging and working with people, not just trying to dilute and see the problem less. So that's my rant. Sorry about that.
Mixed-income housing policies have the ability to further class conflicts and create inhospitable environments for lower-income folks. If people involved in these developments or communities would be a bit more empathetic and see others as humans and not as problems, these issues from mixed-income housing communities may not arise. We need to try to seek to understand others' differences and not immediately see them as less than because of those differences. As mentioned before, one of our guests today, Jeff Neven, is the Executive Director at Indwell. Indwell is a not-for-profit organization in Hamilton that has been urging the city to address issues around poverty and affordability. Along with the continuous advocacy and activism, the organization provides affordable housing for Hamiltonians struggling to find a home. Indwell provides housing for three main subsets of the population: those leaving psychiatric hospitals, those leaving jails, and those using homeless shelters.
Like, we're talking about affordable housing, right? Like, they're still commodifying an element of it constantly by talking about the affordability, and that makes sense because there's some kind of exchange that happens there. But ultimately, like, at some point we got away from just the idea of, like, what is housing, right? Like, what is this for? What is the purpose of it? Like, can we actually just make this as something that meets people's needs, in various ways, instead of just saying, just whatever fits an income and this is good for you. And this kind of speaks more to some of the conversation around the social networks and some of that other stuff. But like, at the end of the day, like, we're still talking about that human element of that. And I think that's a shift that we've made in certain ways, but we need to keep making in different ways. So anytime the human face of that is there and can be that voice to talk about that experience, I mean, we need to kind of amplify those voices more than, again, people who don't have that experience and, might propose something that seems okay on paper but doesn't actually solve an issue, right?
Many people would consider shelter as a basic human right, just as food and water is. Yet shelter in the current context has become an investment. Housing and rent prices in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area are rising rapidly. People are investing in real estate to secure their life savings and retirement savings. This leaves little room for those who are in desperate need of quality, affordable housing. There are structures and systems in place that have led to housing becoming an investment rather than a basic human right. It's time to address those structures that have created this problem of affordability. So the issue remains, how can we achieve affordability? Instead of reacting to instances of homelessness and poverty, there needs to be a proactive approach. This would involve raising incomes, introducing a universal basic income, and stronger social assistance to prevent people from experiencing poverty. There must be change that is actionable. I think there are a lot of students who worry about affordability. Maybe it's for themselves or their families or people who are experiencing poverty right now. There's also a lack of action and a gap in knowledge about how exactly to go about advocating for change.
It's amazing that groups of students are coming together to engage in that conversation. Because, I talked about, when you were all brainstorming, I said when I started my undergrad in 2003, it was weird that I went down to Jackson Square, right? Which is there. So even to come anywhere outside of that, I went to Gage Park and people feared for my life at that point. They're like, why would you go to Gage Park? I was like, it's a great park. You should go. If you've never been, you should actually all go. Yeah, there's a greenhouse. Come on. It's a perfect time to visit a tropical greenhouse. But so I think the fact that we're starting to engage in some of these conversations and look at the here and now, but also that systemic change component is important. And in terms of what direction you can go, there's all sorts of different things, right? I think there's lots of different kind of concepts and ideas, but I would encourage you in various ways to just get out and talk to people, talk to us, sure, but talk to people too that are in communities, and talk to people that are having these experiences, and obviously be respectful of that and the information they're sharing, but understand some of those things and those challenges kind of firsthand there. So yeah, and I think too, it's just problems can seem really big and really hard to move the needle, but I think if we start kind of building some more of that critical mass in the community around addressing these issues in different ways, we can start to push that forward. So
I wonder, John, you're in a particularly good spot to answer that question.
Yeah, I was in your shoes just not that long ago. As a student, for now, we talked a lot about networks. So if make sure you have a way to be building relationships with people who are the most marginalized in Hamilton and those who are homeless. Some of you maybe, I don't know you guys, I don't know where you're at, but I went into my undergrad pretty sheltered, and my parents didn't ever provide me with the opportunity to become friends with people who are homeless. So trusting that at least some of you can resonate with an experience like that. Find ways to do that. If you're not sure where to start, I'm happy to chat after. But that will be we're talking about, a way to extend your networks to those who might benefit from that, and it will not be a one-way beneficial relationship. You will benefit a lot from those relationships as well. And it'll also equip you going into the future, like Greg talked about, policymakers who go for whatever looks good on paper, and you can prevent yourself from falling for whatever looks best on paper by making sure you're also in relationship and walking alongside and sharing to the extent that you can as students in the experiences of those who are most marginalized in Hamilton.
It is quite easy to listen to this episode and think, oh man, we're screwed. The fight's over. Prices are rising. Our systems create massive barriers to accessing social assistance and affordable housing. What's the point? It is important to acknowledge the good that so many are doing, including Indwell. People are fighting to protect those who experience poverty and those who live on the margins of society every day. The answer is quite simple. We need to be human. We need to connect with other humans. Have empathy. See people as people. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you are interested in learning more about affordability and affordable housing, check out the links in the show notes below. Subscribe to the podcast in order to never miss another episode. Take care, everyone.